It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Ramesh Srinivasan. I wanted to thank Halina for inviting me here today, and also wanted to thank Anne for chairing our morning session. Wonderful work, Richard. I'm really excited about what we can do together. So what I'm going to do today is try to tell you a story, and I'm going to try to frame this talk around the story and try to make a couple arguments that are kind of embedded in my work within this story. Of course, there's a very long and academic title in the program that kind of relates to some of my work, but I actually thought of renaming this talk at the last minute. I'm renaming it Community Power, Rethinking Global Media. So this story starts right here. We all know what that is, right? Of course. This was my life. This was my life right after I completed university. I was very interested as a former engineer in the possibility of developing technologies to solve problems. I basically saw the world as constructed of problems. Those problems could be technologically solved through the employment of various formal logical models by which uncertainty could be reduced. We, of course, understand that many of the assumptions that are built into the technological world are based around the idea of reducing uncertainty, modeling the world according to various types of ontological or formal logical models. So I was very interested in this, and I applied this. I actually worked in Amsterdam, and I was working for KLM, and I was also working for robotic sailboats. And I was trying to employ this model as an approach to solve the problems that the organization of KLM in its logistics and the sailboats that tried to sail the North Sea would encounter. Of course, at the same time, we were talking about this expanded access and emergence of digital media, of new technologies. And now, of course, today we see about 6 of the 7 billion people in today's world holding mobile phones in various forms. And of course, this involves some of the more unlikely characters that one might think of as users of mobile technology. So this sort of was something that I was interested in. Can I apply my problem-solving skills, my engineering skills, to think about these types of users, these types of individuals that were emerging in the digital domain, including a holy man in India here on the right-hand side? Of course, that actually seemed really logical. That seemed like a very linear and straightforward manner in which I could continue to expand my work. I could reduce uncertainty, I could solve problems, I could think about the role of technology in shaping cultural and social life all over the world. And then it hit me that there was a fundamental gap in my understanding. I had entered the MIT Media Laboratory, and just like Amar spoke about earlier, I had developed a very strong interest in Buddhist practice, specifically Mahayana Buddhist practice. So I was very interested. I spoke to my professor, Marvin Minsky, who's one of the founders of artificial intelligence, and I asked Professor Minsky, you know, I'm very interested in Buddhism. How does computation relate to Buddhism? I was very interested in the karmic cycles and the metta practices that are part of compassion and the belief of, you know, an eternal life in various forms. And how does that practice connect with the technological understandings that we were supporting and developing at MIT at that time? And Professor Minsky told me, if it cannot be formally logically modeled, it does not exist. And he said, actually, at this time, he was developing a book called The Society of Mind, and he was saying that Buddhism escapes the Society of Mind because it cannot be formally logically constructed using the types of thinking that I was applying in my engineering work to this point. So in his later work, he wrote a piece called The Emotion Machine. So at this point, I started to see what was a fundamental gap in understanding. And this gap is what I describe as ontological. It's the ways in which we choose to speak about the world, the ways we understand how we know what we know, and the ways we choose to express that knowledge. And that knowledge does not always comport itself to many of the standard assumptions by which technologies are encoded, technologies are structured to order the world, and technologies are designed. So who helps me here? Interestingly enough, it's Martin Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger wrote a piece called The Question Concerning Technology. And in this piece, he briefly mentions, but I, of course, really picked up on this, that technology, the root of the word technology is techne. And techne is a Greek term that does not necessarily simply mean the neutral scientific engineering skill of knowing and learning, but he also says it emerges from the poetics and aesthetics of the mind. So technology emerges from poetics and aesthetics. We're speaking about culture here, right? So in this sense, technology can be reconstituted. It can be subverted to be cultural. And of course, it is cultural, but it's cultural in the sense that it was speaking from the culture of Professor Minsky. So I was very interested in this question of the rethinking of technology. So I developed, of course, this diagram, not to put you to sleep here, but this is basically the engineer was still alive within me, and it still is to some extent. I was very interested in the concept of rethinking technology from the perspective of diverse peoples, diverse vernaculars, diverse ways of knowing, diverse ways of seeing, diverse ways of understanding. And this is where the term ontology comes into play here, that I mentioned briefly before. Sort of a theory of what exists, a way in which we choose to speak about how we know what we know. And ontologies can be practiced through language. Of course, we know that in linguistic diversity lies great amounts of cultural meaning. Cultural knowledge is encoded into the semantics and syntactics of different languages. At least so is the theory of Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf. And any of you who are Chinese native speakers, of course, know that you use terms and categorize terms in very different manners based upon the kind of assumptions that are built into the knowledge that is constructed within your language. But my question at this time was trying to think about whether I could take language as a profoundly ontological technology and think about other technologies as well. So, of course, when we talk about new media, or we talk about computation, we're talking about the database, the algorithm, the interface. Are these all techne? Are these all spaces that can be reconstituted, recreated, reformed to actually give voice, give meaning to diverse ontologies, to diverse ways of knowing? So just to give you a couple examples of ontology, let me show you some provocative figures or images. This is a first, what I would see as an ontology. Now, probably most of you may not know exactly what this image is. Most people that I show this image to tell me this is an image of a crocodile. True and not true. This is an image of a being that is an ancestor of the Yolngu, who are Aboriginal people in North Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory in Australia. But it's not simply a representational image. It's profoundly ontological. Why is that? Because it is also a map. But it's not a map that can be simply read from the perspective of Western Cartesian knowledge, even though points in the figure of this godly being relate to points in the landscape. As you can kind of see, shoreline is represented here, Baraka, and so on. So this is very interesting, right? The way the Yolngu people actually engage with this form is they walk the landscape, they tell stories, they speak the land, and they sing the land through their songlines. But this is a form that also accompanies them in their process of engaging with the landscape. So this is something that does not figure easily well into the formal logical quality by which we tend to construct, the history of museums and technologies as they stand. So how do we begin to work with this as an ontological device into another way of thinking about technology and media? Here's a second image. This is a Kipu proverb string. So the Kipu is not practiced very widely today, but it was fundamental to many elements of Incan civilization in the Peruvian Andean region. So what is this? This is actually a radial system of mapping that is at play here. The proverb string actually was used and carried across different territories and regions to encode messages as they were sent from one person to another. But the proverb string was also used as a form of account keeping. just like literacy emerges in this similar manner. So this sort of string is an ontological glimpse into the Incan culture of this time period. And in fact, we find that strings were used in terms of denoting representation, denoting mapping, before they were even used as forms of clothing in this Incan era. So I find these two examples highly fascinating and interesting in terms of how I might begin to rethink how we sort of work with culture and community in the context of technology. So I'm going to briefly share with you two examples of projects that I'm leading, and then we can have a longer discussion later. The first actually relates to my time as a PhD student when I was asked by the leaders of 19 Native American reservations to work with these communities in the San Diego County in the United States, and also in Baja California, which is across the Mexican border, and try to think about how they could take advantage of the fact that they had some form of wireless internet access that was provided by the state government and by Hewlett-Packard, and actually build some kind of digital environment with these communities to empower heritage, sharing, communication, and the rekindling of networks that had been destroyed over many years of colonization and exploitation. So this is a GIS map of the communities that I was asked to work with, 19 reservations. And what's very important here is as you look at the GIS map, some of these communities might seem close to one another, but they're actually infrastructurally disintegrated or fragmented from one another. Because we can't just tell space through spatial geography, but also through landscape and infrastructure as well. So these communities were what they describe as pushed into the rocks. They were pushed away from the ocean. Traditionally, they were seafaring communities. They were communities that were agrarian, and they were pushed onto the sides of mountains. So you can't really do much seafaring. You can't catch fish, and you can't do much planting when you're on the sides of desert mountains. So there's infrastructural fragmentation, but there's also spatial fragmentation, and finally, there's temporal fragmentation, meaning these communities were disconnected from common elements of cultural heritage, cultural memory. Traditional language was mostly lost. Plant medicines were mostly gone. Storytellers were absent increasingly across the communities. So technology does not solve these issues, but employing it as a tool in the voice, in the ontologies of people within these communities might rekindle something. It might generate something new. It might generate a new imaginary, a new future, a new notion of aspiration. And part of that is the recognition that when we work with technologies, when we work with media, we don't assume that there's this rupture, that there's this discontinuity from that which exists already. In fact, peoples already have connections. Peoples already have networks. We often talk of ourselves entering what we call a network society. But a network society has existed in different forms, in different manners, through different forms of mediation over hundreds, if not thousands of years. And this is an example of the small amount of a network society that existed with these communities when I was asked to come and join them. This is Jane Dumas, a medicine woman, one of the only people that everybody across the 19 reservations had some connection to. It's like a connection on Facebook that everybody knows one another, right? But in this case, it was what we call a human network. So receiving Jane's blessing was very important to the ontology that which we created this system. So then we went further, and this is an image I've shown to some of you before, and we actually started to map out a classification, a structure by which this system we were designing could be created and mapped out. And this is not necessarily the same as the Kibu proverb string or the Aboriginal map. It can be described in logical manners. However, the categories here and their relationships with one another were created by people across these 19 communities. So there are terms here like order or ocean or medicine people that may not exist in a very lively manner within these communities today, but they relate to people's imaginary, people's goals, people's visions. So for us, this was really important. How can we empower this as a first order of an ontological way to create a technology that could bring people across these 19 reservations back together. So this was the Tribal Peace Project that we worked on. It lives on servers within these communities. It's owned by people within these communities, and it's being used in a variety of different manners even today. And this is an image of the interface we created. Again, it's not your standard user interface. In fact, many user interface design people were not too happy with me when I created this. It doesn't show a lot of information in a sort of formal sense, but it's built around metaphors that were very important in the ontology of these communities, specifically the manzanita tree, which is a collective symbol of rebirth. So it's a different way of thinking about design that's not so much based in the practice of the designer, but is situated within the production of knowledge that exists within communities with which I had the joy of getting to work and collaborate with. Okay, so that's one project. Here's a second project, much more pertinent probably to people in the room. Relates to museums and heritage and this expanded notion of digital museums. This is a group of my friends here. They are elders and museum practitioners, but they come from the Zuni tribal community. Now, Zuni is a Native American community that is located in a rural part of New Mexico. They have a very strong set of traditions. Things weren't quite fragmented in the same manners as the previous example that I showed. But what's interesting here is the Zuni have pushed forward through their own tribal museum initiatives a new way forward. They've thought about how they can productively use technology according to their own ontologies. And what they've been interested in is this sort of digitization of objects that's been happening. Of course, we know museums, some in very vile manners, have taken Zuni objects through archaeologists and art collectors over hundreds of years. So these objects of Zuni patrimony are sitting in museums all over the world. And many museums, as Richard was pointing out as well, want to push the paradigm forward. They want to be more participatory. They want to engage with technology in ways that kind of shape them as public spaces. So we have 10 museums now all over the world connected to us. These are museums that are digitizing Zuni collections, and they are interested in working with the Zuni to promote a new way forward, a new third space, a new way to share multiple perspectives, multiple ways of knowing, multiple ontologies. And what my friends at Zuni are doing here is they're looking at a bear skin. And it's really interesting because when they analyze the bear skin, they don't simply analyze it based on its material qualities in the sense of a scientific materiality, but they actually analyze it relative to animals they see in their own landscape and stories that they tell to themselves and with one another. So we've built a system now with 10 different museums connected, where there's about 1,500 objects that are being digitized and shared across these different museums. And the Zuni have their own local access into this system where they can access images of objects that are sitting in these museums all over the world. It's not repatriation, it's access. But this form of access could influence local networks and local ontologies and revitalize the practices within these communities. And this is a really interesting example of this. This is called an anahoho. It's something like a kachina, but it's not a kachina. They call it an anahoho. There have been no anahohos that have been part of Zuni religious and cultural life for about 150 years. And what happened when a group of Zuni came into the museum to look at this anahoho was fascinating to me. I was given the privilege of being able to be part of this experience. So they come together. It's not one user per computer. It's a collective process of reflecting and viewing. And it's not so much what you enter into the computer. It's about how you have dialogue and experiences around the image or that which is produced through the technology. It's this production of reflection that happens. And what's happening here is that people start putting their fingers in their ears at various points while they're having this conversation. Why is that? It's because there are these practices that exist within cultural life where some people are supposed to know some knowledge and other people are not supposed to know other knowledge. So those practices, those very cultural constructs are reconstituted in the new media context. It's a production of an ontology, but it's not about the technology here, it's about what's produced through this form of access. And we find that highly interesting because people start changing languages as well. Well, they see the anahoho because sometimes Zuni, like any ontology, can best give glimpse into that way of knowing only through the language itself. So they change languages based on who they want to communicate with and how they choose to speak about this object. So this is an example of what we actually start to see happening across all of these images. A profound difference between, on the right-hand side, the museum catalog as it exists around a set of objects, 150 objects we've surveyed across Zuni, and what the Zunis say on the left-hand side. We can see that there's some similarities around names and descriptions and materials, but the Zuni tend to profoundly talk about these objects according to stories, according to practices, according to their ways of actively and materially engaging with these objects. And this tends to get stripped out of the narrative of a museum. And this is really important because this is profoundly what the object is about for these communities. So the museum has to not just respect these voices, but choose when the communities say, we don't want to share this material. We don't want to share this information. And so we're trying to push that paradigm forward. And just out of curiosity, I was very interested in thinking not just about how museums speak about the world differently than indigenous people, but how Google chooses to speak about the world. So I just looked this up the other day. Maybe it's the Swedish, access. And the first access, the first retrieved link to Zuni pottery was pottery as commodity, eBay. And every other link here are links to various art collector websites. So what's absent here is not just the stories of the Zuni, but the question of how that pottery is being represented in the contemporary world is based around commodity and fetish, and the fetish of collection. So this, of course, is part of our world today, but the question for me is, what world do we want to believe in? And how do we rethink techne to produce and construct that world? Because more generally, I believe this is a question about the future of the internet and the future of new media, as I'm writing about in my next book. I actually think the internet might need to look more like this. This was a random drawing I created. This is more of a complex adaptive system. It's a decentralized set of networks. Some would argue the internet is this type of network, but I would argue ontologically it is not. It is much more like that Google screenshot that I just showed. So what's happening here? There are local hubs of knowledge production, and there's some information shared as it stands to these other nodes, right? So there's hubs and there's nodes connecting them. There's links connecting them. Because ultimately, the way we choose to speak about the internet and the future of digital media tends to be highly vacuous. We tend to talk about the future of new media as the cloud. Does anyone want to tell me what the cloud is? And Kevin Kelly, one of the founders of Wired magazine, in his most recent book, argues he wants us to think about what technology wants. What about what we want? Or what about who are we? Those are questions that I think need to be asked, because if one peers more deeply past the particular types of narratives or fairly vague metaphors like the cloud, you start to see satellites that are strategically configured, that are creating infrastructure over the planet. And you also see images like this. This is an image of fiber optic cables underneath the water, underneath the oceans, that connect or disconnect the world in which we live. And what one finds is that's highly uneven. If anything, the internet reproduces digital inequality rather than produces the sort of notion of oneness, of Om, of cloud. And what one finds here is there's only 3 fundamental fiber optic cables that connect the continent of Africa to the rest of the planet. So if anything, we want to materially peer into the infrastructures of the cloud, of the internet, of the network, of the museum, by really thinking about the question of ontology. Thank you very much.